In our series on the Bible as history, we've been going through the chronological stages as laid out for us by Harold L. Wilmington in his book, The Wilmington's Guide to the Bible, in his books, The Basic Stages and the Book of Ages, the way I learned my own biblical history. So he was the first um, teacher, the first fruits of my biblical training, and he set the stages for all of my training that came afterwards. I always think in the stages that he laid out. He died recently, and I am taking a moment to say how grateful I am for the training that I received at the beginning of my biblical training from Dr. Wilmington. So we've already talked about his stages. We've talked about the creation stage. We've talked about the patriarchal stage. We've talked about the Exodus stage, and now we are on the conquest stage. This stage begins with a very fearful pronouncement from God: Moses, my servant, is dead. So Moses has led them at 80 years old. He led them through the waters of the Red Sea. He led them through 40 years of wandering. He led them through all of their disobedience, all of their rebellion, all of their grumbling and complaining. He provided water from the rock. He provided meat and manna, and they were dependent on him, even though they groused about it all the time. They were dependent on him, and so you can imagine the instability when right now, on the other side of the Jordan, the only land you have was taken by Moses on the east side of the Jordan, and you have not yet crossed over into the promised land to have land of your own when your leader dies. Right? So are the promises going to come true? I'm worried that we will have the same kinds of rebellion and grumbling and complaining that we've seen before. And so you can imagine the instability of the people as they stand on the edge of the Jordan River, ready to go into the land, and their leader, whom they have grumbled against, but whom they have depended on, is dead. So God calls Joshua. And you can imagine Joshua's reticence. It's not recorded, but boy, if he was me, and knowing what I know about the people of Israel as we watched them wander in the desert, I would have been a little bit reticent to take up the mantle that Moses laid down. And yet God says to Joshua, be strong and very courageous. Meditate on God's word day and night, and you will have the promise of good success. So this is the promise that God makes to Joshua, to slowly in the eyes of Israel to begin to exalt Joshua so that he can accomplish the tasks that God began with Moses. So after the call, God says to Joshua, I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel by Joshua doing a similar kind of miracle to the kind of miracle that Moses did. You remember Moses parting the Red Sea and the people walking through on drier ground? It is nice to know that God is so with your new leader that this leader can also part the water and allow you to walk across on dry land. It gives you confidence that the new leader will be as in tune with what God is doing as the old leader. Joshua instructs them as they pass through the Jordan River to gather 12 memorial stones, one for each tribe, to set up on the other side to remind people of what God has done. And so there are 12 memorial stones on the west side of the Jordan set up to remember what God has done. It's interesting that they must at Gilgal take a moment and circumcise that male generation. For 40 years they wandered in the desert, and in their sometimes obedience, sometimes disobedience, circumcision, the sign of the covenant with God and with the people of Israel, was neglected. Right? You can't circumcise twice. So that generation failed in their responsibilities of passing on that covenant to the next generation. And so Joshua will do it here at Gilgal. Before we take the land, we are going to be in right relationship with God. And of course, there's this interesting little pericope right after that that talks about Joshua coming face to face with the commander of the Lord's army and asking the question, are you for us or for our enemies? And the commander of the Lord's host says, neither. He is from God himself, and he's coming to fight with Israel. And Joshua goes face down before this possible theophany to recognize in this God's promise to go with them as they begin to take the land that God had promised to Abraham many years before. So the war for taking the land that is promised breaks into three parts. We're going to start with the central campaign, then we're going to talk about the campaign in the south, which comes next, and then the campaign in the north. And it's interesting how God lays this out. And by first moving across the Jordan River and the first battle being Jericho, Jericho is the high and mighty city in the promised land. And to watch it fall first is going to give people the fear of Israel that will allow them to move with impunity to take the land that God has promised to them. So you know the story of the fall of Jericho. You know Rahab's testimony that the whole people of the promised land have been shaking in their boots because they know what God has done on the east side of the Jordan and how he has delivered the east side of the Jordan and given it into the hands of two of the tribes. And so now Rahab's testimony emboldens the spies as they escape to tell Joshua that everybody is living in fear. And so Joshua follows the instructions of God in surrounding the city and marching around it and blowing the trumpets, and all of the walls fall, and they burn the city, the first fruits of what God has given them in the promised land. So the first city is devoted to God, burned, and then everything else will be given to the people of Israel: cities, walls, fruit, gardens, trees that they have not planted, they have not earned, but comes to them as a gracious gift of God in receiving what they get in the promised land. Unfortunately, when they finish with the Battle of Jericho, which is a complete and utter success, one man, Achan, has not been obedient. And so they move out to take. Joshua doesn't even send the whole army to go against Ai. It's a little bit of nothing. And yet the armies of God are defeated at the little bit of nothing town of Ai, the dump, when they were just responsible for bringing about the destruction of the head city of the promised land in Jericho. And the defeat comes, and it's a warning to God's people: with me, you can do incredible things. Without me, you can't do diddly, right? So they figure out where the sin is in the camp. Achan admits it. Achan gives up the things. Achan and his family are stoned as a result of his compromise. And then they are able to go and take Ai, and the central campaign then, after this bump in the road, continues. The Gibeonites, as we'll see later, they are Hivites, and they want peace. They want realize what God is doing, and they make quick tracks to deceive Joshua into letting them live. They assume Joshua will remain true to the covenant even in the midst of their own deception. And that turns out to be the case. They will be slaves, they will carry the water for Israel, but they will not be destroyed as a result of their deception of Joshua and his men. So that's the central campaign. What God seems to do at this point is, in order to expedite the process of giving the promised land to his people, the king of the south, Adonai-Zedek, The Lord is righteousness, translates his name, but he gathers the kings of the Amorites, whether they're Horam, the king of Gezer, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, the hill country. He's putting together a coalition of the cities of the south to try and withstand the attack of Israel in the Promised Land. And in that attack, um, by winning and then doing mopping up operations after that, Joshua is able to take the whole southern part, which includes the hill country, the Negev. Um, and so it's almost as if God is gathering the enemies to destroy them in as quickly and as efficiently a manner as he can. The same thing happens then. Central campaign was a success. Southern campaign has been a success. And now Jabin, the king of Hazor in the north, is shaking in his boots, and he gathers as many kings together, a great horde, and he brings them down to meet Joshua. And it looks overwhelming, but again, the commander of the Lord's host is in charge. And he says to Joshua, "Do not worry. Tomorrow at this time, I will give over all of them slain to Israel." You see, in this conquest of the promised land, God is fighting, God is at work, God is drawing the enemies together in order to destroy them, in order to give the land to people who are more obedient to Him. Which brings up the question that is often asked: what is moral about the ban in which God tells his people to kill every man, woman, and child in the promised land? And so to do that, we have to kind of go back and remember what God told Abraham, that Abraham's descendants would be taken into, they would be sojourners in another land for 4 generations, and then they would come back and be given the land at long last that God has promised to Abraham. So Abraham dies a nomad. He dies a pilgrim. He owns no land in the promised land except the cave of Machpelah, which he bought in order to bury his dead. And yet God promises that his people, his generation, those who would be as many as the stars, as many as the sand of the sea, they would be given the land and they would come back and possess it. So it's part of the promise of Abraham, and it says, interestingly, that the Canaanites who are living there, the Amorites, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, God will give time for the Amorites to repent. Their sin is not yet full. So we can assume that when Joshua is leading this conquest, that God has brought an end to the mercy and the grace that he's been extending to the Amorites, and Joshua and his people are the beginning of that judgment. Remember, the commander of the Lord's army is fighting with Joshua and his people. And we have this verse in Joshua chapter 11. There was not a city in the promised land that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, who were the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So there we are, a little bit of an understanding of what is going on when God fulfills his promise to Israel, and in doing so brings about the judgment that is now due to the Canaanites and the people who lived now previously in the land. After the central campaign and the northern campaign and the southern campaign have been wrapped up, it becomes Joshua's task then to distribute the land, and he distributes it by tribe, and he distributes the land by lot. In each of the tribes, then, they have a responsibility to build cities of refuge. These are places that if I unintentionally kill another person, and the kinsman redeemer, the avenger of blood, the person from that family who's responsible for bringing justice for the spilled blood of a relative, cities of refuge were the place that you could run and live at peace and be tried, and as long as you stayed in the city, you could be protected from that vengeance. when the land is divided, the eastern tribes will receive no land on the west side of the Jordan, and so they are then freed. They were given the east side of the land if they would fight with the rest of Israel to take the promised land, because they had already been given peace. So now the eastern tribes will return. There is a dispute over a memorial that the eastern tribes build, and it makes the western side of the Jordan upset that they have so far, seemingly at least, um, given up on following God. And so war is about ready to break out, civil war between the west side of the Jordan and the east side of the Jordan, until they send a message and the eastern tribes say, oh, God forbid that we should rebel against God. This is not an idol. This is not something to be worshipped. It is a memorial to remind ourselves that we are brothers with those on the other side of the Jordan. And so everyone breathes a sigh of relief, and war is averted, and the covenant is renewed again at Shechem for a new generation. Now, I want you to listen to Joshua as he gives that final admonition to the people. As he is now old, the conquest of the land has taken place largely. They have broken the back of the promised land through the central campaign and then the northern and southern campaigns, and now each tribe is responsible for holding on to and extending to take all the land that God has promised. But tribe by tribe, they will do that, and tribe by tribe, they will be more or less successful in that enterprise. But as Joshua is about ready to pass off the scene, he reminds the people of Israel in a final speech of what their responsibilities are before God. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the Jordan, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Great, fitting conclusion to a faithful life, leading a whining, complaining, but now victorious people of Israel. And at the end, he reminds them, you have a choice to make, and your responsibility is to follow God for you and for the generations that follow.